The sterile air of the trauma center cold room awaiting examination bit at my exposed skin, an unpleasant contrast to the humid late summer outside. The low thrum of the cooling units was the only sound, a monotonous drone that seemed to swallow all other noise. I pulled my gloves tighter, the latex a second skin against my palms, and approached the stainless steel table. A sheet, crisp white, covered the form beneath. Beside it, the forensic examiner, a woman whose face was usually a mask of weary detachment, looked grim. "Read," he acknowledged, his voice hushed, "we've got Dr. Thorne." I nodded, my gaze fixed on the slight mound the sheet made. Dr. Aris Thorne. Brilliant, reclusive bioengineer. Gone. The initial reports had been clear, a catastrophic lab accident. A tragic miscalculation, perhaps, or a desperate act of self-destruction. The official narrative was already firming up, a tidy, unfortunate package. Cause of death? I asked, though I already knew the preliminary findings. Massive blunt force trauma, severe burns, internal organ rupture consistent with a high-energy blast, the examiner recited, pulling back the sheet with a practiced motion. The scent of ozone and char, faint but persistent, clung to the fabric, even here. What lay beneath was a testament to raw, destructive power. Thorne's body was a ravaged landscape of purples, blacks, and angry reds. His lab coat, or what remained of it, was fused in places to his skin, a grim second layer. His face, thankfully, was mostly spared the worst of the direct impact, though soot streaked his brow and his eyes were wide, unseeing. This wasn't a man who had gone peacefully. I leaned closer, my breath shallow behind my mask. The examiner pointed out specific fractures, the extent of the thermal damage. It was all textbook for a contained explosion gone terribly wrong. My eyes, however, weren't looking for the obvious. They rarely did. They sought the anomalies, the whispers beneath the shouts. My gaze drifted down Thorne's left arm. The sleeve of his lab coat was mostly intact, though scorched, the heavy fabric having offered some protection. Beneath the torn cuff, on the pale skin of his forearm, just above the wrist, I saw it. A cluster of minute, almost perfectly circular scorch marks. 4 of them, arranged in a neat, symmetrical pattern. They were distinct from the wider, more chaotic blast burns, like pinpricks of concentrated heat, too precise, too uniform. My internal alarm bells, usually a faint chime, began a slow, insistent toll. These marks weren't consistent with the general thermal spread of a blast. They suggested a point of focused, localized heat, applied with an almost surgical accuracy, before or simultaneously with the main event, in a way that defied the chaotic nature of an explosion. A blast scatters, these marks collected. "See something, Reed?" the examiner asked, observing my stillness. "Perhaps," I murmured, my voice muffled. I didn't elaborate. Not yet. The official narrative would hold, for now. But those marks, faint as they were a crack in the facade. They spoke of control, of intent, not accident. They spoke of something far more deliberate than a tragic mistake. If these marks were real, truly anomalous, then the scene of devastation, Thorne's state-of-the-art bioengineering lab, was not a mere accident site. It was a canvas for a meticulously hidden truth. Hours later, the acrid tang of burnt electronics and scorched metal still hung heavy in the air within the skeletal remains of Thorne's research facility. The outer shell, a sleek, imposing structure of reinforced concrete and tinted glass, looked deceptively calm against the afternoon sky. Inside, however, was a maelstrom frozen in time. I navigated the labyrinth of twisted steel beams and shattered safety glass, my boots crunching on debris. The air conditioning system, once humming with precise climate control, was mangled, its vents gaping like silent screams. Sheets of fire-resistant paneling lay peeled back, revealing charred conduits and exposed wiring. A detective, a burly man with a perpetually tired expression, waved me over from a section marked off with yellow tape. "Still looks like a massive thermal event, Reed," he stated, gesturing vaguely at the devastation. "Pressure surge, maybe a containment breach. It's a miracle anyone found a body." I nodded, acknowledging his assessment, but my eyes were already scanning the immediate surroundings. The central workspace, where Thorne's groundbreaking research was housed, was the epicenter of the destruction. A massive, complex piece of machinery, a bioreactor of some kind, was ruptured, its titanium shell buckled and torn. Consoles were melted into grotesque sculptures, monitors reduced to shards of blackened glass. The sheer force required to achieve this level of destruction was staggering. Yet, I couldn't shake the image of those precise scorch marks on Thorne's arm. The accident narrative, so easily accepted by others, felt increasingly flimsy to me. Here, among scattered papers and what looked like a half-eaten protein bar, I found it. Embedded in the melted plastic of a keyboard, barely visible, was a tiny, almost crystalline fragment. It shimmered faintly under the beam of my penlight, a faint blue-green hue. It was unlike any material I'd seen among the typical lab components. I carefully extracted it with tweezers, dropping it into a sterile evidence bag. This fragment, coupled with the precise burns on Thorne's body, suggested a foreign element, something introduced with purpose. This wasn't an accident. This was a cover-up, meticulously orchestrated, and Dr. Aris Thorne, the brilliant recluse, had been murdered. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh, unforgiving glow on the stainless steel tables and the hushed movements of the examination staff. I stood by the primary table, my breath pluming faintly in the cold, observing the remains of Aris Thorne. The lead examiner, a quiet man with precise hands, pulled back the sheet. The sight was expected, yet unsettling. Thorne's skin was a patchwork of severe burns, particularly concentrated on his torso and arms, yet curiously spared in other areas. The blast, if it truly was a blast, had been selective. Initial assessment points to massive internal trauma, consistent with extreme concussive force, the examiner stated, his voice low and clinical. He gestured to the visible injuries. The burns are deep, third degree in places, but notice the pattern. He was right. There were areas of his clothing, what remained of it, that showed scorching, but not the widespread, chaotic shredding I'd expect from a full-scale bioreactor rupture. And the face, though singed, lacked the severe charring that would accompany a direct, unshielded exposure to an explosive thermal event. It was as if something had protected him, or the force had come from a specific angle, with a specific, unnatural intensity. "Any signs of struggle?" I asked, my eyes fixed on his hands. They were clenched, but not in a defensive posture. More like a final, desperate grip. The examiner carefully turned one hand over. No abrasions or contusions indicating a fight. Some epidermal tearing from the heat, but that's it. My attention drifted to Thorne's left forearm, near the wrist. Among the blistered skin and soot, something caught the light, a minute, almost invisible glint. I motioned to the examiner. There, on the radial side. Can you get a closer look? He adjusted his magnification lens, and I leaned in again. It was tiny, no bigger than a grain of sand, embedded just beneath the surface of the skin. He carefully extracted it with tweezers, placing it on a sterile slide. Under the scope, it resolved into a microscopic fleck of iridescent, non-metallic composite material. It shimmered with a faint, almost pearlescent sheen, utterly unlike anything I'd seen in Thorne's lab. No glass, no metal, no polymer from any industrial-grade equipment. This was something else entirely. This isn't from the lab, I murmured, my mind already racing, connecting this anomaly to the unusual burn patterns. A straightforward accident would have left behind fragments of glass, metal, biological residue. Not this. This was an outlier, a contaminant, an unwelcome guest at the scene. It screamed intent. My suspicions solidified into a hard knot in my gut. Thorne hadn't died by accident. He had been murdered, and the perpetrator had gone to extraordinary lengths to stage the scene, to make it look like a tragic miscalculation. The precision of the injuries, the specific nature of the lab's destruction, and now this microscopic, alien trace element, it all pointed to a killer intimately familiar with Thorne's work and the mechanics of his environment. Someone who knew how to make a death look like an act of God. The next step was to probe the human element, the rivalries and resentments that always simmered beneath the surface of high-stakes research. Thorne had been a visionary, but visionaries often left a trail of bruised egos and broken promises. My first interview was with the rival scientist, a Dr. Silas Vance. He was a man whose reputation for brilliance was almost equal to Thorne's, though his methods were considered more conventional. He sat across from me, impeccably dressed, his posture rigid, a thin veneer of civility barely concealing a simmering resentment. Thorne was an acquired taste, Vance stated, his gaze distant. Brilliant, yes, but utterly ruthless. He saw collaboration as a weakness, a concession. My team had been working on a similar biosynthesis process for years, only for Thorne to leapfrog us with his breakthrough. He claimed proprietary rights to certain methodologies that, frankly, we felt were already in the public domain. It led to some rather heated exchanges. Heated enough to wish him dead? I asked, watching his hands, which were clasped tightly. Vance scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. Wishing someone dead and making it happen are two entirely different things, investigator. Thorne was a formidable competitor, yes. But I prefer to win on merit, not through sabotage. He had motive, and a clear benefit. Next, I spoke with the former research assistant, Maya. He was younger, her eyes still red-rimmed, but there was a hard edge to her grief. She'd worked under Thorne for 3 years before abruptly leaving 6 months prior. He promised me co-authorship on the initial papers, a significant share of the intellectual property, she began, her voice tight with suppressed anger. I poured my life into that lab, worked 18-hour days. Then, when the critical breakthrough came, he cut me out. Said my contributions were ancillary. I was just a pair of hands to him, a disposable resource. He stole my work, my ideas. Did you confront him? I pressed. She nodded, a bitter laugh escaping her. Repeatedly. He just dismissed me. Told me if I wanted recognition, I should start my own lab. I threatened legal action. He just laughed. Said he had lawyers who could bury me. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her hands. I hated him, yes. He was a monster who preyed on ambition. But I wouldn't kill him. Two plausible motives, two individuals who had suffered under Thorne's competitive and secretive nature. The rival scientist, benefiting from Thorne's absence. The former research assistant, fueled by a potent blend of betrayal and professional injustice. Both had the means, in a general sense, to wish Thorne gone. But neither seemed to possess the specific, intricate knowledge required to stage such an elaborate, technically sophisticated act of murder. And I intended to find out who held that knowledge. The investigation had just begun. The metallic tang of sterile air assaulted my senses, a familiar prelude to the grim task ahead. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and something else, something deeply organic and irrevocably final. Thorne's body lay beneath a sheet, a silent testament to the violence that had claimed him. My gaze traced the outline of his form, searching for something the initial sweep might have overlooked, a physical anomaly that could mirror the digital ghosts I suspected were lurking in his lab. Anything new? Read? The attendant, a woman with tired eyes and hands that moved with practiced efficiency, asked, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the quiet. I shook my head, my eyes still fixed on the sheet. Just connecting the dots, or trying to. The physical evidence feels incomplete, somehow. It was more than a feeling, it was a gnawing certainty. The burn patterns, the residue, they spoke of an accident, yes, but the nuance felt off, too perfect. My mind kept circling back to the lab, to the digital footprint. Back at the secure research facility, the controlled environment of Thorne's main research bay felt eerily preserved, a snapshot of a genius interrupted. The air scrubbers hummed, maintaining an impossibly clean atmosphere. My colleague, a specialist in digital forensics, was hunched over a bank of monitors, his brow furrowed in concentration. He gestured me closer. Reed, take a look at this. His voice was tight, betraying a rare flicker of excitement. On the screen, a complex web of data streams glowed. Thorne's primary project, designated Project Chimera, revolved around advanced genetic sequencing. It wasn't just theoretical, the potential applications, whether for eradicating global scourges or crafting biological deterrents, were immense, terrifyingly so. My colleague pointed to a series of timestamps. These are recent. Very recent. Just days before. Before the incident. He zoomed in on a specific segment. We're seeing highly sophisticated data manipulation here. Not just an amateur trying to cover tracks. This is layered, almost like a ghost in the machine. Someone was systematically altering records, obfuscating access logs, making it appear as if certain files were never touched. That they were accessed by routine automated processes. My eyes narrowed. An attempted wipe? More than an attempt, he corrected, his finger hovering over a cluster of green lines. A meticulous, almost surgical deletion of specific project files. Not the entire project, mind you, just certain, highly sensitive subsections. But the ghost data, the residual energy signatures, they're still there. It's like trying to erase a shadow by simply turning off the light. This was an orchestrated act, designed to mislead, to vanish. It suggested either an external party with deep knowledge of Thorne's systems, or Thorne himself, attempting to hide something monumental before his demise. The tension in the room thickened, palpable as the hum of the servers. I found Maya, Thorne's primary research assistant, in a small break room, staring blankly at a lukewarm cup of synthetic coffee. She looked smaller than I remembered, her usual sharp intelligence dimmed by a pervasive weariness. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the mug. "Maya," I began softly, pulling up a chair opposite her. "We're looking into some irregularities in Dr. Thorne's digital records. Specifically, Project Chimera." She flinched, a subtle tremor running through her. "Attempted file wipes." She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. He was always so careful. Paranoid, really. Said they were watching. Said they wanted his work. Who, Maya? Who was watching? She shook her head, a slow, deliberate movement. He never said. Just them. He started encrypting everything, even things he'd already secured. Working through the nights, muttering about loose ends. He looked over his shoulder constantly. Truly afraid. More than I'd ever seen him. Did he ever mention specific threats? Anyone trying to access his files? She wrung her hands. He just said they were getting closer. That the containment wouldn't hold much longer. He started keeping a small, encrypted drive with him all the time. Never let it out of his sight. Said it contained the truth. He had it with him, didn't he? When? When it happened? My mind raced. A small, encrypted drive. No such item had been recovered from the scene or Thorne's person during the initial collection. The only items were standard personal effects. If it existed, it was gone. This wasn't just about a murder anymore, it was about what Thorne was trying to protect, and who was desperate enough to take it. And that, I realized, made this case infinitely more dangerous. The hum of the spectral analyzer was a low, steady thrum against the quiet of my lab. Hours had melted away, each minute a focused excavation into the infinitesimal. The microscopic trace, barely visible to the naked eye even under magnification, was now a vibrant, shifting spectrum on the display, a dance of peaks and valleys telling a story. My fingers hovered over the console, adjusting parameters, refining the beam's focus. I chased every anomaly, every deviation from expected organic compounds. The initial analysis had been frustratingly generic, pointing to common industrial residue, easily dismissed as environmental contamination within a bustling research facility. But the specific burn pattern, the one that defied the chaotic spread of a typical lab fire, had gnawed at me. It suggested a directed force, a precision that shouldn't leave behind a random, innocuous dust. This trace, embedded deep within the charred remains, had to be connected. I narrowed the wavelength, pushing the machine to its limits. The peaks sharpened, resolving into a distinct, unmistakable signature. My breath hitched. It wasn't organic. It wasn't a byproduct of Thorne's known experiments. This was something synthetic, a complex molecular chain that screamed manufacturing, not biology. I cross-referenced the signature against global databases for rare materials, industrial polymers, specialized coatings. The system churned, millions of entries flying by, before finally, a match. A rare, synthetic polymer. Used primarily in high-end industrial applications, often for aerospace components, advanced robotics, or specialized protective gear. Its properties included extreme heat resistance and an unusual electrical conductivity. It was designed to withstand environments far more volatile than Thorne's lab. This wasn't something you'd find in a standard research facility, certainly not in the quantities implied by the residue. It was a material engineered for specific, demanding tasks, and it was expensive. My mind raced, connecting the dots. This polymer wasn't a random contaminant. It was a tool, or part of a tool, used in the commission of the act. The burn pattern, the precision, the lack of widespread damage, it all started to make sense. Someone had used something highly specialized, something capable of delivering a directed, intense burst of energy, leaving behind only this unique fingerprint. This discovery blew the lid off the initial theories. Suicide? Accidental miscalculation? Impossible. This polymer pointed to deliberate, sophisticated action. It pointed away from academic rivalries, away from disgruntled colleagues. Omnicorp immediately sprang to mind. They were Thorne's primary funding source, a conglomerate notorious for its aggressive R&D and ruthless acquisition of intellectual property. I contacted the detective, my voice tight with urgency. Forget the suicide theory, I told him, and put a pin in the lab accident. I've got a new lead, and it points directly to Omnicorp. The sleek, glass-and-steel edifice of Omnicorp loomed over the city, a monument to corporate power. Inside, the air was cool, sterile, and faintly scented with something expensive and artificial. The reception area was minimalist, all polished concrete and concealed lighting. Every surface gleamed, reflecting my own weary face back at me. I felt like an intruder in a pristine, carefully curated world. The liaison, a man named Sterling, met me in a small, soundproofed conference room. He was impeccably dressed, his suit tailored to perfection, his smile a practiced, almost too wide curve. His eyes, however, held a flicker of something guarded, like a well-trained guard dog waiting for the command. "Investigator Reed," he greeted, extending a hand that felt firm but oddly lifeless. "Thank you for coming. Omnicorp is, of course, fully committed to assisting in any way we can with this tragic incident concerning Dr. Thorne. A brilliant mind, truly. A great loss." His voice was smooth, modulated, every word chosen with precision. "Mr. Sterling," I began, cutting to the chase. "My investigation has uncovered a unique synthetic polymer at the scene. It's a specialized material, not something found in standard lab equipment. I'm trying to determine if Omnicorp has any connection to this material, perhaps through your R&D or manufacturing divisions, or if it was supplied to Dr. Thorne for any of his projects." Sterling's smile didn't falter, but a subtle tension tightened around his jaw. "A polymer, you say? Fascinating. Omnicorp's reach is vast, investigator. We dabble in many advanced materials. Could you be more specific about the nature of this polymer?" I described the unique spectral signature, the properties of extreme heat resistance and electrical conductivity. "It's a rare compound. Very specific applications. We're looking for any record of its production, procurement, or use by Omnicorp, or any of your subsidiaries, particularly in relation to Dr. Thorne's work." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "I see. While I'm not privy to every single material acquisition across our global operations, I can assure you, Dr. Thorne's projects were primarily biological and bioengineering in nature. We provided him with standard lab equipment, funding, and administrative support. Nothing, to my knowledge, involving high-end industrial polymers of that description. Certainly nothing that would be used within his biological research. He paused, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. Unless. Perhaps it was part of some new, experimental piece of equipment he was testing? Dr. Thorne was always pushing boundaries. Was Omnicorp developing any such equipment for him? I pressed. Or did you provide him with the means to acquire it? Sterling shook his head slowly. Not directly, no. Our agreements were clear. He had autonomy over his research methods, within ethical and budgetary guidelines. We trusted his genius. If he was experimenting with novel hardware, it would have been at his discretion. We merely provided the framework. His cooperation felt forced, a performance designed to deflect rather than inform. It was the kind of help that gave you nothing tangible. And access to his lab? I asked. Who had it? Beyond Thorne himself, of course. A very limited number of authorized personnel, Sterling replied instantly. Security was paramount, given the sensitive nature of his work. Myself, a few senior R&D managers, and his 2 primary research assistants. All logged, all monitored. The lab was a fortress, investigator. That's why the idea of an external breach seems improbable. Improbable, but not impossible, I countered, my gaze unwavering. And what about the encrypted drive? The one that was missing from the scene? Sterling blinked, his smooth facade cracking for a fraction of a second. An encrypted drive? I'm afraid I have no knowledge of any such item. Thorne kept meticulous digital records on our secure servers. Any personal storage would have been his own affair, not something Omnicorp would track. The interview concluded with a stack of generic corporate policy documents and a promise of full transparency that felt utterly hollow. As I walked out of the gleaming Omnicorp tower, the sterile air did nothing to clear the growing suspicion in my mind. The web of connections was tightening, and the threads led directly into the heart of corporate power. The encrypted drive, wherever it was, felt more crucial than ever. The polymer trace, a microscopic shard of synthetic material, pulsed under my lab microscope like a malevolent star. Its unique crystalline structure and tensile strength were unlike anything commercially available. I'd spent the last 24 hours mapping its molecular fingerprint, cross-referencing it with every known industrial and experimental composite. Nothing. This was bespoke, crafted for a very specific, high-stress application. It screamed Thorne's genius, and it screamed danger. My gut tightened. This wasn't an accident. I packed my notes, careful to secure the samples in their designated, tamper-proof containers. The fluorescent hum of my personal lab felt unusually loud, the silence outside my door too absolute. As I stepped out into the late afternoon, the city's usual drone seemed muted. I drove my sedan onto the highway, the setting sun painting the skyline in hues of bruised purple and orange. My mind was still dissecting the polymer, trying to connect it definitively to Thorne's advanced research. Then, the world warped. A dark sedan, sleek and without identifying marks, materialized in my rearview mirror. It wasn't just following, it was aggressive. I signaled to change lanes, but it hugged my bumper, then swerved sharply into the lane beside me, cutting me off with brutal precision. I had to yank the wheel hard, my tires squealing in protest as my sedan lurched onto the shoulder, kicking up a spray of gravel. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. The engine idled roughly. Too close. Too deliberate. No casual driver would risk that maneuver on a busy highway. It felt like a warning shot, precisely aimed. The incident put an edge on my return to the lab. I'd made a habit of small, almost unconscious security checks, a pen placed precisely at an angle on my desk, a specific book left slightly ajar. These were my internal tripwires. The door lock, a biometric system, registered no forced entry. Everything looked normal. Too normal. My pen was exactly where I'd left it, but the faint dust motes on its surface, undisturbed before, were now subtly shifted. A drawer I knew I had pushed all the way in was out by a millimeter. Someone had been here. They hadn't taken anything obvious, hadn't even left a visible mark of entry. They just looked. My research notes, the ones detailing the polymer's unique properties, were still on my desk, but the faint impression of a thumbprint, not my own, marred the top page. They knew what I was looking at. They knew I was getting closer. The escalating threats solidified my conviction. This was about something far more dangerous, something someone was willing to kill to protect. The polymer wasn't just a trace, it was a weapon. I needed to see Thorne again, or at least the evidence directly related to his physical state. The security officer, a burly individual named Miller, gave me a curt nod as I signed the logbook. The air hit me, a frigid, sterile blast that carried the faint, metallic tang of preservation. Thorne's covered form lay on a gurney, still. I didn't need to uncover him to feel the weight of what had transpired. I pulled up the comprehensive digital report, focusing on the microscopic analyses of the tissue samples taken from the burn sites. The polymer. Its interaction with organic material under extreme heat. The burn patterns Thorne sustained weren't simply from a flash fire. They were too precise, too localized, almost as if an external agent had been used to accelerate the destruction in specific areas. The polymer, designed for high tensile strength and heat resistance, could also act as a catalyst, focusing and intensifying thermal energy. It wasn't just a byproduct of the explosion, it was a component of the ignition, a sophisticated accelerant designed to mimic an accident. This wasn't a lab mishap. This was a targeted, engineered assassination. The thought sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The urgency of the situation pressed down. He had been evasive before, scared. Now, after the near miss and the breach, I understood that fear. I called her, my voice low and steady, asking for a discreet meeting away from Omnicorp. He was already there when I arrived, hunched over a lukewarm cup, her gaze fixed on the street outside. Her hands trembled slightly as she took a sip. I shouldn't be talking to you. Someone tried to run me off the road today, Maya. Someone broke into my lab. I kept my voice even, letting the facts hang in the air. They know I'm looking at the polymer. They know I'm looking at Thorne. And I think they know you know something. Her eyes widened, glistening with unshed tears. He pushed his coffee cup away, his voice cracking. I saw him read. Before it happened. A few times. Late at night. Not an Omnicorp employee. He was tall, lean. He didn't use the main entrance. He just appeared. Slid in and out of the lab after hours. I never saw his face clearly, but the way he moved, the way he just knew how to bypass the secondary security protocols. It wasn't right. I thought maybe it was some secret project Thorne was on, something classified. I was scared to say anything. Scared of what Thorne would do, or what Omnicorp would do. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I should have told someone. I should have done something. My mind raced, connecting Maya's terrified confession to the engineered polymer, the precise burn patterns, and the escalating threats against me. An unknown individual, intimately familiar with Thorne's lab, his work, and its security vulnerabilities. This wasn't just corporate espionage. This was something far deeper, far more calculated, and now, far more personal. I was no longer just an investigator. I was a target. This wasn't just corporate espionage. This was an assassination, meticulously disguised, and the precision involved chilled me far more than the ambient air of the secure facility where Thorne's remains now rested. My thoughts were a whirlwind of fragmented data points, Maya's terrified confession echoing alongside the image of the destroyed lab. The room was stark, efficient, bathed in the hum of unseen refrigeration units. A single overhead light cast a harsh, unwavering glow on the stainless steel examination table. Thorne lay beneath a thin sheet, a silent testament to the violence that had claimed him. A uniformed officer stood by the entrance, a silent sentinel. I nodded to the attending forensic technician, a woman with weary eyes and meticulous hands, who was preparing her instruments. She understood my purpose without a word, gesturing towards the table. Any preliminary observations before the full procedure? I asked, my voice low. The technician consulted her notes. External burns consistent with high thermal exposure, but localized. No obvious defensive wounds. Internal analysis pending. The degradation of certain tissues is unusual, almost targeted. Targeted, I murmured, pulling on a pair of nitrile gloves. This aligned with my growing suspicion. I carefully drew back the sheet, revealing Thorne's face, serene in death, untouched by the chaos that had engulfed his lab. My gaze dropped to his hands, his torso. The burns were precisely as the technician described, severe, but not widespread. This wasn't a general conflagration. It was a surgical strike. The texture, the pattern, it spoke of an extreme, localized event, not a diffuse explosion. I noted the absence of soot in certain areas, the peculiar, almost crystalline residue clinging to others. This wasn't random. This was engineered. Thank you, I told the technician, my mind already racing back to the digital realm. The body held its secrets, but the machines, the systems, they held the blueprint of the attack. Back at the secure data processing center, the screens of my workstation glowed with a dizzying array of telemetry. I'd spent the last 48 hours submerged in Thorne's digital footprint, peeling back layers of encryption and proprietary code. The lab's environmental control system, its sensor network, its experimental equipment logs, all of it was laid bare before me. The initial findings had been a masterclass in misdirection. A spike in energy consumption, a rapid temperature increase, a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. All consistent with a catastrophic failure of Thorne's experimental apparatus. But consistency, I'd learned, was often a killer's most elaborate camouflage. I isolated the moments leading up to the incident, cross-referencing sensor data with equipment activation logs. The lab was a closed loop, a meticulously controlled environment. Every breath of air, every joule of energy, every micro-variation in pressure was recorded. And Thorne, with his obsession for data, had left an incredibly detailed trail. The first anomaly wasn't a malfunction, it was a command. A subtle, almost imperceptible adjustment to the oxygen-nitrogen mix, logged as a routine recalibration. But it wasn't routine. It was followed by a fractional increase in the inert gas supply, just enough to begin subtly altering the atmosphere, making it less conducive to combustion, yes, but also less conducive to life, if left unchecked. Then came the temperature spike. Not a sudden explosion, but a rapid, controlled ascent, originating not from the experimental chamber itself, but from the auxiliary heating coils embedded in the lab's ventilation system. A preheating, I realized, for something else. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the logs for Thorne's specific experimental protocols. He was working with a highly volatile, yet incredibly stable, polymer, the same polymer I'd found traces of on the burn patterns. It required specific atmospheric conditions, a precise temperature threshold, and a controlled introduction of a catalyst. The sequence was too perfect. 1. Atmospheric manipulation, the inert gas introduction, slowly displacing breathable air, making the environment hostile, but also priming it for the next stage. This wasn't to cause immediate death, but to incapacitate, to disorient. 2. Preheating, the ventilation coils, designed to maintain optimal research conditions, were repurposed to rapidly elevate the ambient temperature of the lab, pushing it just below the polymer's flash point. 3. Pressure drop, this was the crucial part. Not a vacuum, but a sudden, localized pressure drop within the experimental chamber, triggered by a faulty pressure release valve that had been remotely overridden. This drop would have drawn in the superheated, inert gas-rich atmosphere, concentrating it. 4. Catalyst introduction, the final, fatal step. A surge of energy, a specific frequency, pulsed directly into the experimental chamber, recorded as a system overload. But it wasn't an overload. It was the precise energy signature required to destabilize Thorne's polymer, turning it from a stable compound into a rapidly expanding, intensely exothermic reaction. The result, a contained, yet incredibly destructive, flash event within the chamber, mimicking a critical experimental failure. The intense, localized heat, the sudden pressure wave, the rapid consumption of oxygen within the immediate vicinity, all perfectly designed to cause Thorne's death and destroy the evidence of the manipulation. The widespread damage to the lab, the melted equipment, the shattered containment units, all secondary effects, designed to obscure the true cause. This wasn't an accident. It was a meticulously choreographed act of violence, a digital ballet of death. The killer hadn't just accessed Thorne's systems, they understood his research, his specific protocols, the bespoke vulnerabilities of his unique lab setup. They knew exactly how to turn Thorne's own groundbreaking work against him, making his final project his executioner. The person behind this wasn't just a hacker or a corporate rival. They were an architect of destruction, intimately familiar with Thorne's mind and his creations. And they were still out there. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent hum mirroring the frantic pace of my thoughts. This was far more complex, far more dangerous, than I had initially imagined. My gaze dropped to his hands, his torso. Not the chaotic, indiscriminate charring I'd expect from a lab accident, but something almost deliberate, like a macabre signature. The edges of the burns were too clean, too sharp. It was as if the intense heat had been applied with a specific tool, a focused beam rather than a widespread thermal event. Targeted, I murmured again, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. This wasn't some random, tragic miscalculation. This was controlled. Artful, even, in its brutal precision. The rest of his body was largely untouched, a stark contrast to the destruction wrought upon the facility around him. It reinforced my growing suspicion. Thorne hadn't been caught in an explosion, he had been subjected to something intensely localized, a method designed to kill him while leaving the appearance of a larger catastrophe. The attendant, a quiet individual whose job it was to assist with these examinations, shifted his weight by the door. I could feel his impatience, but I ignored it. Every detail mattered. I ran a gloved finger lightly over a particularly deep lesion on Thorne's forearm. The skin was leathery, the tissue beneath desiccated. Why such a method? Why not a bullet, a blade, a poison? The answer kept circling back to the lab's destruction. But if the goal was simply to steal his research, why such an elaborate cover-up, and why destroy the lab? A simpler, less conspicuous theft would have sufficed. The destruction of the facility suggested a deeper motive, something beyond mere acquisition. It implied a desire to erase, to prevent. To prevent what, exactly? The completion of his work? Its public release? My mind raced. Thorne was brilliant, a visionary. His research, even in its incomplete state, was groundbreaking. If someone wanted to stop him, it wasn't just about profit or intellectual property. It was about control. Control over the implications of his discoveries. The thought sent a shiver through me, colder than the room's ambient temperature. This wasn't just corporate espionage gone wrong. I finished my examination, logging every observation, every anomaly. The physical evidence, meticulously collected from the lab and now from Thorne himself, painted a picture of calculated violence. The killer was intimately familiar with Thorne's research, his lab's intricate systems, and perhaps, even Thorne's own habits. They didn't just want him dead, they wanted his legacy erased, his future contributions nullified. Hours later, hunched over my forensic workstation, the faint hum of the servers a constant companion, I dove into Thorne's digital life. The lab's primary servers were heavily damaged, but I'd managed to salvage several encrypted drives and his personal laptop from a reinforced safe. The corporate network, which Omnicorp had been quick to secure, offered little. My focus was on Thorne's personal files, his research logs, his communications. I sifted through thousands of documents, lines of code, experimental data sets. It was a digital maze, meticulously organized yet sprawling. Thorne had kept comprehensive records, detailing every step of his progress, every hypothesis, every setback. He was a scientist to his core, leaving no stone unturned, no observation unrecorded. But as I delved deeper, a pattern began to emerge. There were gaps, subtle discontinuities in the numbering of his research logs, brief periods where his usual meticulous entries ceased, only to resume later as if nothing had happened. I cross-referenced file creation dates with system timestamps. There were files that didn't quite fit the chronological sequence, appearing to be older or newer than their surrounding entries. It was almost like a digital sleight of hand. I isolated these anomalies, flagging them for deeper scrutiny. One particular sequence of log files caught my attention. They were heavily encrypted, far more so than his standard research data. The encryption protocol was bespoke, complex, suggesting Thorne had gone to extraordinary lengths to protect their contents. This wasn't just a password, it was a fortress. It took me the better part of another day, employing specialized decryption algorithms and drawing on every resource at my disposal. The system fought back, its layers of protection designed to thwart even the most determined attempts. Sweat beaded on my forehead as the progress bar crawled forward, agonizingly slow. The tension in the small room was palpable, a silent battle between Thorne's digital defenses and my relentless pursuit of the truth. Finally, with a soft chime, the last layer broke. The files opened. What I found wasn't scientific data, not in the traditional sense. He wrote about the immense power of his discoveries, the potential for both profound good and unimaginable destruction. He had been working on something truly revolutionary, something that could alter biological systems at a fundamental level. He wrote about Omnicorp, his primary benefactor, and their clandestine funding of a separate project, one that twisted his core research into something horrific. He called it Project Chimera, a weaponization initiative that went against every moral fiber of his being. He detailed how Omnicorp had been pressuring him, subtly at first, then more overtly, to divert his findings towards their dangerous agenda. He couldn't stand by. He intended to expose Omnicorp, to reveal the truth about Project Chimera and their plans to weaponize his discoveries. He had gathered irrefutable evidence, a digital dead man's switch, set to release if anything happened to him. My gut twisted. This wasn't just murder. This was an execution, orchestrated to protect a secret that could reshape the world in terrifying ways. Thorne wasn't killed for his research, he was killed to prevent its exposure. The game had just changed. I wasn't just hunting a killer, I was hunting a corporation, and they had just shown me how far they were willing to go. My gaze remained fixed on Aris Thorne, or what was left of him. The preliminary report had been accurate, almost clinically so, in its description of the cauterized lesions. They traced a deliberate pattern across his torso and hands, uniform, almost artistic in their precision. Not the chaotic, explosive damage of a lab accident, but something else entirely. Something controlled. My gloved fingertip hovered inches above one such mark, a perfect, oval-shaped burn just below his sternum. It looked less like an injury and more like a brand. Accidental charring would be irregular, a splash, a splatter. This was a signature. A cold dread settled in my gut, not for the deceased, but for the chilling intellect behind his demise. The level of sophistication required, the intimate knowledge of Thorne's groundbreaking work, the lab's intricate systems, it all pointed to an insider. Someone who knew the dance. I spent another hour in that sterile space, documenting every detail, every nuance of the burn patterns, the subtle discoloration around the edges, the depth. The lead forensic technician, a quiet woman with sharp eyes, watched me from a respectful distance. She offered no theories, only assistants, handing me tools, adjusting lights. Theories were for later, once all the facts were laid bare. This wasn't just another investigation. This was a hunt for a ghost, a professional who could erase their tracks with the same precision they'd used to end a life. I made my way to the temporary command center established in an unused wing of the research facility, a space now bristling with monitors and data cables. The air was thick with the hum of servers and the muted chatter of my colleagues sifting through mountains of digital evidence. "Reed," a colleague called out, "anything new from Thorne?" I shook my head, already pulling up the secure network interface on my dedicated console. More questions than answers. Focus on the access logs for the main lab. I need every entry and exit, every system override, every remote access attempt for the last 72 hours before the incident. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of motion as I initiated cross-referencing protocols. The sheer volume of data was staggering, thousands of lines of code, security camera feeds from every angle, biometric scans, swipe card entries, and the digital footprints of research protocols. The first pass narrowed the field to 27 individuals, senior researchers, lead technicians, and a handful of administrative staff with elevated security clearances. Too many. I layered in the specifics of Thorne's final project, the parameters of the experimental apparatus, the unique energy signature required for its operation. This wasn't just about getting into the lab, it was about knowing how to weaponize it, how to turn its complex mechanisms against its creator. The list shrank rapidly. Senior researchers, yes, they understood the science. But few possessed the systems-level expertise to orchestrate such a sophisticated failure. Technicians had the practical knowledge, but often lacked the theoretical depth. I filtered again, cross-referencing the remaining names against their specific skill sets listed in their employee profiles and project assignments. My screen glowed with a new, much shorter list. 6 names. 6 individuals with the rare combination of high-level access, detailed scientific understanding of Thorne's work, and the technical proficiency to execute a complex system override. One name, in particular, caught my eye, the Omnicorp liaison. He was an executive, not a hands-on researcher, yet his profile contained an unusual breadth of technical certifications, far beyond what his corporate role would typically demand. I dug deeper, pulling up his extended background check, the one usually reserved for top-tier security clearances. The liaison's resume, meticulously curated for public consumption, omitted a crucial chapter. Before joining Omnicorp, he'd spent years in a specialized government intelligence unit, a branch focused on industrial espionage and counterintelligence. The pieces began to click into place, forming a disturbing mosaic. The case had been largely buried, its details obscured by legal wrangling and non-disclosure agreements. But the name of a key operative, an individual who had successfully infiltrated the rival company and extracted sensitive data, resurfaced in my memory. The operative's profile matched the Omnicorp liaison's prior government role. A direct connection. Not just a motive, but a proven methodology. Thorne's research, potentially world-changing, represented an unimaginable fortune. If the liaison had a history of acquiring valuable intellectual property through illicit means, Aris Thorne's death suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. He wasn't just a corporate representative, he was a potential architect of a murder designed to look like a tragic accident, a ghost in the machine. I had my prime suspect. Now, I needed to prove it. The sterile hum of the air filtration system was the only sound in my office, a low, constant whisper against the frantic beat of my own thoughts. I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking patiently, awaiting my command. This was it. The culmination of weeks spent sifting through digital dust and physical debris. I typed out the internal memo, a carefully crafted piece of disinformation. It spoke of a critical stabilization breakthrough concerning Aris Thorne's Project Chimera, a breakthrough I hadn't actually made, but one that would resonate deeply with anyone intimately familiar with Aris's true, hidden work. The memo implied I was on the verge of replicating his final, unstable compound, the very thing that Omnicorp wanted buried. The bait was set. The next few hours were a study in strained patience. I retreated to a quiet corner of the facility, ostensibly reviewing older case files, but my attention was split, listening, waiting. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, every distant footfall sharpened into a potential prelude. I knew the corporate representative, Aris's brother, was still on site, ostensibly assisting with the cleanup of Aris's research. He was the only one who would recognize the true danger in my fabricated discovery, the only one whose employers would be directly threatened by it. Just after midnight, the security feed from my office flickered cloaked in the dim emergency lighting, moved with practiced stealth. The corporate representative. My breath hitched. He wasn't subtle enough, not for my carefully rigged system. He slipped into my workstation, his movements efficient, almost desperate. A data wipe. He was trying to erase everything. I moved then, a blur of motion across the quiet floor. The door to my office swung open with a soft thud, startling him. My posture was relaxed, but my muscles were coiled tight, ready. The corporate representative recovered quickly, a practiced mask of indignation settling on his face. "Reed. What are you doing here?" "I was just checking on the system, thought I heard something." He gestured vaguely at the silent terminal. "No need for excuses," I said, stepping fully into the room, letting the door click shut behind me. "I know what you're doing. And I know why." His gaze darted around the room, searching for an escape, a denial. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The critical stabilization breakthrough in Project Chimera," I supplied, watching his face closely. The name alone was enough. A flicker of fear, quickly suppressed, but I saw it. "It's a false lead, designed specifically for you. This is harassment." "Is it?" I walked over to a secure evidence locker built into the wall. The room was designed for the meticulous cataloging of biological and material evidence, a place of stark finality. On a stainless steel table, beneath a focused task light, sat a series of slides and petri dishes. "This," I began, gesturing to a microscopic image projected onto a nearby screen, "is the trace polymer I found at the scene of your first attempt on Aris Thorne's life, the supposed accident with the faulty wiring. A unique synthetic compound, barely visible to the naked eye, designed to degrade rapidly after initiating a specific thermal reaction." I switched the image. "And this is the same polymer, recovered from the remnants of the catastrophic lab accident that killed Aris. The burn patterns, the specific degradation signature, they match perfectly." His face, which had been pale, now seemed to drain of all color. He stared at the images, then at the physical samples in the petri dishes. His eyes were wide, fixed, like a man seeing his own reflection in a funhouse mirror. And finally, I continued. My voice low, this is a sample of the same polymer, recovered from the data port of your personal secure terminal. Embedded there when you attempted to wipe the evidence from Aris's lab server. The corporate representative swallowed hard, his throat working. Not the whole corporation, a faction within it. They were developing bioweapons. Aris discovered it. He was going to expose them, go public with everything. He had the data, the protocols, the experimental results. He looked up, his eyes pleading, desperate. They tasked me to neutralize him. To make it look like an accident. First, they wanted to discredit him, isolate him. When that failed, they ordered me to eliminate him and destroy all evidence of his true work. They said he was a liability, a threat to global stability if his research fell into the wrong hands. But it wasn't his research they were worried about. It was supposed to leave no trace, just a catastrophic failure of his own making. He slumped against the stainless steel table, his shoulders shaking. I loved my brother, Reed. But they threatened everything. My family. My career. Aris Thorne wasn't just a victim of an accident, but a casualty in a war he hadn't known he was fighting. And I was now holding the key to unlocking a far greater conspiracy. And I was now holding the key to a corporate empire's darkest secret. The air in the interrogation room had finally exhaled, leaving behind a stale, charged quiet. The confession, wrung out drop by agonizing drop, detailed not just his direct involvement in Aris's death, but the machinations of the larger entity he served. Omnicorp's executives, fearing Aris's revolutionary research could destabilize their existing market dominance, or worse, fall into rival hands, had applied relentless pressure. David, caught between loyalty to his brother and the terrifying power of his employers, had made a fatal choice. He'd meticulously planned the accident, ensuring Aris's research would be contained, controlled, and ultimately, weaponized by the very people who orchestrated his demise. My colleague, the lead detective on the case, moved in, his voice firm, reading David his rights. The heavy click of handcuffs echoed, a stark punctuation mark to the end of a long, torturous investigation. I watched David being led away, his eyes, for a fleeting moment, locking with mine. There was no defiance left, only an empty acknowledgement of the inevitable. Hours later, the adrenaline had begun its slow, painful ebb, leaving behind a profound weariness. Aris Thorne lay on the stainless steel table, covered by a sheet. This was my final visit, a last, somber confirmation before his release. The official cause of death would now be updated, a deliberate act replacing the initial, convenient accident. I pulled back the sheet, just enough to see the familiar contours of his face, now devoid of the spark that had driven his genius. The world outside was a different beast entirely. The news had broken like a tidal wave. Initial reports, fueled by leaks from my team, painted a damning picture. The arrest of David Thorne was just the first domino. Within hours, warrants were issued for several high-ranking Omnicorp executives. The CEO himself was brought in for questioning, his public image of philanthropic innovation shattering under the weight of corporate espionage and murder. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. Aris Thorne, once a reclusive figure, was now a posthumous martyr, his story a cautionary tale of ambition and corporate greed. The ethical debate ignited like wildfire. Where did the line lie between scientific advancement and corporate responsibility? Was innovation truly a force for good if its custodians were willing to eliminate those who dared to push boundaries too far? I stared at Aris's still face, the questions swirling in my mind. His research, once a closely guarded secret, was now the subject of intense global scrutiny. Governments, international organizations, and even rival corporations were already vying for control of his final project, a bioengineering breakthrough that promised to revolutionize energy production, but also held terrifying potential for misuse. The implications were staggering. A single man's vision, twisted and exploited, now threatened to reshape geopolitical landscapes. My role in uncovering the truth had ended one chapter, but inadvertently opened a Pandora's box of wider implications. I had sought justice for Aris, and I had found it, but the cost was far greater than I had anticipated. The tension, which had been a constant companion throughout the investigation, hadn't dissipated. The fight for his research, for the very soul of his discovery, was just beginning. And I, an investigator of the dead, was now an unwilling witness to the birth of a new kind of war. I stood by a stainless steel table, a sheet-draped form resting upon it, awaiting the detailed scrutiny I would soon provide. My breath plumed faintly in the stark overhead lights, reflecting off the polished metal surfaces. The scent of disinfectant, sharp and sterile, did little to erase the lingering phantom smell of ozone and burnt organic matter that still clung to my memory from Aris Thorne's lab. My gaze was fixed on the draped form, but my mind was miles away, replaying the last moments of the interrogation. David Thorne's carefully constructed facade had finally fractured, revealing the raw, ugly ambition beneath. The chilling flicker I'd seen in his eyes had resolved into something more profound, a desperate, envious hunger. He hadn't just wanted to control Aris's research, he'd wanted to be Aris, to claim the genius as his own, to wield the power of that groundbreaking work without the inconvenient presence of its true architect. The details had emerged like shards of glass, painful and sharp. The modified safety protocols, the deliberate miscalibration of the containment field, the subtle alterations to the air filtration system that ensured the toxic byproducts would remain trapped, concentrated, lethal. It wasn't a spontaneous act of rage, but a meticulously planned execution, hidden behind a veil of scientific accident. The microscopic trace I'd found, the unusual burn pattern, they weren't just anomalies, they were David's fingerprints, left behind by a man who thought himself too clever to be caught. I remembered the quiet conviction in his voice as he'd spoken, not of remorse, but of necessity. The corporation, he'd argued, couldn't afford for Aris's work to fall into the wrong hands, or worse, to be mismanaged by Aris himself, whom David viewed as naive and unsuited for the cutthroat world of commercial bioengineering. He'd seen himself as the protector of a legacy, even as he was its destroyer. A classic tale of jealousy and corporate greed, amplified by the staggering potential of Aris's research. The truth, once uncovered, was always simpler, and always more twisted, than the initial complex web of possibilities. This case had been different. It wasn't just about a life taken, it was about the desecration of a pursuit, the corruption of knowledge. Aris Thorne had pushed the boundaries of what was possible, driven by a vision that, in the wrong hands, could reshape the world in terrifying ways. David's actions, while criminal, highlighted a deeper, more insidious threat, the unchecked ambition that often accompanies groundbreaking scientific discovery. Where did the line blur between progress and peril? Between ethical advancement and reckless exploitation? My role was to find the truth of what happened, but the why always forced me to confront the larger, more unsettling questions about human nature and the very fabric of scientific ethics. Uncovering these truths, seeing the depths of human depravity disguised as corporate strategy or brotherly rivalry, took its toll. David Thorne was now facing the consequences of his actions. The evidence I'd gathered, meticulously documented and presented, was irrefutable. Justice, in this instance, would be served. Aris Thorne's research, once a beacon of hope and a source of deadly ambition, was now secured, its future uncertain but at least out of the immediate grasp of those who would pervert it. There was a sense of closure for Aris, a quiet vindication for his brilliance and his tragic end. This wasn't the last time I would stand in such a place, dissecting the remnants of a life, searching for the truth hidden beneath layers of deceit. The relentless march of scientific discovery would continue, and with it, the potential for both extraordinary good and profound evil. There would always be those who sought to exploit, to control, to kill for power or profit, no matter the cost. I took a deep breath, the sterile air filling my lungs, a stark contrast to the dust and decay of the living world outside. The sheet-draped form on the table before me was a fresh puzzle, a new set of questions waiting to be answered. Another life, another mystery. The world kept turning, and with it, new secrets would emerge, new crimes would be committed, new injustices would cry out for a meticulous eye and an unwavering commitment to the truth. And I would be there, ready to listen.